I think it is clear to believe in the power of ideas.
Fresh thinking to the Manhattan Institute.
Fly. What makes a deal actually be in the public interest and be understood to be in the public interest? And we have a panel in which we're going to explore this from the point of view of a scholar who has been looking at this for a very long time, the dean of public finance business journalists, somebody on the front lines in the investment community, and finally, a skeptic. So we'll have dueling Harvardians here, and that will be our panel. I'd like to begin with somebody who has been thinking about this privatization decision for decades. E.S. Steve Savas is the presidential professor at Brooke College here in New York, and his areas of expertise include public management, strategic planning, privatization and public-private partnerships, service delivery, and performance measurement. He's the author of the 2000 book, Privatization and Public-Private Partnerships, which he tells me has been translated into 21 different foreign languages. And he tells me that he first started chewing on this question quite a long time ago, but I'll let Steve begin by telling that story. Steve Savas.
Thank you. Yes, it was as a city official in New York in 1969 that I first started thinking about, talking about, and writing about, and then studying privatization. It was a very heretical notion, front-page stories in the newspapers and so on. And so I figured, well, it is heretical, so maybe it'll take 2, 3, 5 years before the ideas catch on. Here, 40 years later, we're still trying to figure out what it is, how to do it, when to use it, when not to do it, and so on. As we've heard, yes, P3, PPP, public-private partnerships, are widely used throughout the world. The United States is lagging in this respect, however, and one indication of that is that whereas there are many large global organizations in this field, the largest American organization ranks 22nd in activity in these public-private partnerships. I want to focus on United States roads. And first, I'll talk about greenfield projects, then about brownfield projects. Greenfield projects are brand new projects. They don't exist yet. These are somewhat easier to work with. Brownfield propose a different set of problems. Why P3? Why private capital? Well, there is a shortage of public funds, yes, and you can look at it many different ways, but by and large, there are serious budget shortfalls in virtually all state and city governments. There are bonding limitations as to how much money can be borrowed, and there's a lot of voter resistance to bonding proposals. And by contrast to this apparent shortage of public funds, there seem to be substantial amounts of private capital around. There are private infrastructure funds, which as of a week ago anyway, were about more than $300 billion was available in these private infrastructure funds. Pension funds have been investing in them, and perhaps sovereign wealth funds will be getting into that as well. But what are the benefits of P3 for infrastructure projects? One, there's a general perception and reality that many publicly financed public works projects are wasteful in various ways. They are funded according to a political formula rather than to economic viability, leading to pork barrel projects of various kinds. My favorite is the occasional 4-lane highway leading to a 2-lane bridge. And the point is, why is the bridge so narrow? No, the problem is that the highway is too wide. That is, public money was used to build a wide highway in rural areas, essentially as a means of buying votes, and it was not required. And yet now the drumbeat is for widening the bridge to nowhere instead of narrowing the highway. So that's one kind of problem that exists. The toll-based projects are privately financed. That gives confidence that the project is financially viable It will have a return on investment. It does make economic sense rather than being essentially a vote-generating scheme. There's another clue about project viability. If a private firm insists on a play or pay provision in the contract, that should give one warning. Here's what I mean by the pay or play means that if the financial target is not met, then the government makes up the shortfall. Good example I saw of that in Mexico. There's a very large, there's a very nice, beautiful toll highway running from Mexico City down south through Cuernavaca to Acapulco, and this is a public-private partnership. But however, the studies on that were done by the Ministry of Transportation, the Mexican federal government agency, and they did their traffic studies in the region based on less than 1 year's worth of data. And the private contractor, the private concessionaire, was skeptical about it and insisted on a pay-or-play provision. And so, if the tolls did not achieve a certain minimum standard, the federal government would have to make up the difference. And that, in fact, is what's been happening. And the federal government has been losing a lot of money on that. I've been driven on that highway. I was driven about 2 hours south of Mexico City on that beautiful road, deserted. We were doing about 85, 90 miles an hour. And so I enjoyed it a lot, but the Mexican people have been paying for that ride. The toll-based P3s make possible innovative projects that might not otherwise be considered. For example, private firms throughout the United States have been looking at HOV lanes, high-occupancy vehicle lanes, and proposing transforming them into high-occupancy toll lanes, HOT lanes, with dynamic tolling, where tolling varies not only by time of day, but by degree of congestion on the main road, for which represents an escape lane. Those kind of private opportunities arise. Entrepreneurs see these opportunities and figure there may be an opportunity here for a PPP. Another example is someone is proposing a tunnel under the Long Island Sound connecting Syosset in Long Island to Rye in New York State, and some initial estimates looked at that might be feasible as a PP3. It's far from a delineation yet, but that's an example of the kind of ideas that can arise once you consider this option. And finally, as Professor Gomez-Ibanez pointed out, one can expect faster, more efficient construction, fewer cost overruns, and more on-time completion. In addition to the construction issue and the basic design and financing arrangements, there are advantages, of course, of privately managed infrastructure. Private operators can adopt new technologies faster than governments can. They can better adapt to changing circumstances because they have much greater labor flexibility, and they're not stuck with civil service titles and restricted work rules. As things change, as the environment changes, as the nature of the road may change, they can change their labor forces around to utilize to take advantage of the changes and adapt to that. Private firms did many studies on this, and again, Professor Gomez-Ibanez referred to this: more efficient and more effective road maintenance and road operation. Many studies have been done in the municipal sector of various kinds of public works services, and again, savings of 30%, 40% are routinely found in that domain. Savings in privatized social services are not as large, but in public works kinds of functions, there are very large operating savings are being achieved. Another advantage of private operation is that congestion can be minimized by installing dynamic tolling mechanisms and arrangements, and this can be done rather readily under a privately run road rather than under a publicly operated road. And finally, a private operator can spread the risks, pool expertise, and can call on their experts wherever they are, whatever talents are needed, unconstrained by geographic or political boundaries, and much easier than trying to arrange for specialized consultants each time you may need one for this purpose or another. So that's the advantages of using public-private partnerships for greenfield projects. With respect to brownfield projects, they are a different kettle of fish. These are existing roads. These are existing roads, usually toll roads, and so there's no additional political problem there. Politicians want to lease them, and they seek large upfront payments now and not long-term franchise fees spread over the 25 to 99-year life of the concession. So here are the problems. As was pointed out, such long-term agreements may wind up being incomplete in one way or another, and they can't possibly remain in effect, leading to very, very difficult renegotiation problems down the road. The second problem is that investors may be more at risk than the public. If there's a public outcry about what's going on a privatized toll road, there may be a strong public outrage, and public officials are more likely to react to local outrage from aroused citizenry than from distant investors far away. And the decisions are likely to be made that will be to the local benefit and will harm the investors. And finally, the big problem, what about the use of this upfront windfall that's being sought after? Well, it could go into a lockbox to be used only on long-term transportation projects in the state. This was proposed in Pennsylvania by Governor Rendell. And Al Gore does have an unused lockbox lying around somewhere, so perhaps that could be pressed into service for that purpose. But another problem is another thing that could be done with the upfront payment is to divert it to pay for past operating expenses. Governor Corzine in New Jersey wanted to do exactly that, to get a lot of money up front for privatizing either the New Jersey Turnpike or the Garden State Parkway, and then using that money to pay off the unfunded pension liabilities which have been promised to public employees for these many decades. And third, we should never ignore the possibility of surreptitiously siphoning off the money for miscellaneous purposes. Governments can do strange and wondrous things. My favorite is Governor Mario Cuomo, who needed money to balance the New York State budget a few years ago, and he sold a 23-acre parking lot at the Aqueduct Racetrack in Queens to the Port Authority. Now, I suppose a parking lot and a racetrack does qualify as a transportation infrastructure project, but anyway, it was sold, as I say, from a racetrack to the Port Authority. Port Authority had nothing anywhere within tens of miles of the place, but the money went to the state, and the racetrack, the expenditure stayed on the books of the Port Authority. In conclusion, the public-private partnerships are a powerful method to get needed infrastructure built, but like all government actions, it must be done transparently, skillfully, and with eyes open. Thank you.
Which was the transportation project at Aqueduct, the racetrack or the parking lot? Our next speaker truly is the dean of public finance journalists, Bill Reinhard, the publisher of Public Works Finance, and I would be remiss if I didn't note that free copies of this excellent newsletter are available on the table in the outer room there, and it's a costly newsletter, so do not fail to take advantage of it if you're one of the lucky ones who gets a copy of this great publication. We've been talking this morning as if this PPP situation is entirely prospective, but Bill Reinhardt's been covering it, in effect, for many, many years from his perch as the editor of a newsletter, and I've asked if he would verse us in what is already going on as far as public-private partnerships in transportation. Bill Reinhard. Not at all. But you have to move closer to the microphone. Move the microphone closer to you.
Very good. Thank you. I'm not sure I'm going to give a great survey of the business, but I would like to give you sort of what's the state of play right now from a journalist perspective, and I guess the title of my speech is "What's All the Fuss?" For those of you who are preoccupied doing other things right now, I'd say that you're not going to miss much privatization action. As one of the industry's top financial players admitted to me last week, I don't think this business works anymore. The model of rating agencies and liquidity and cheap money has been broken, and a new model has to be reinvented for this business. Time will tell. A lot of governments are in bad shape, and the big players in this business have a time horizon of half a decade or more in terms of developing new projects. I have two predictions. along those lines that I'll make at the end of my talk. I started public works financing in my basement in 1988, and a few years later, Larry Mohn, the president of the Manhattan Institute, came to my house in Westfield, New Jersey, and he offered to bless my little enterprise by bringing it into the Manhattan Institute. I was very impressed with myself. But I convinced Larry then, and I believe it's true now, that this infrastructure privatization megatrend is not a trend at all, certainly not in the United States. Rather, it's a market made up of one-off opportunistic deals. I also told Larry it's a market that's defined by want, not by need. Huge numbers about infrastructure backlogs don't make a real difference. What does make a difference in terms of what actually gets done is the will, commitment, and endurance of a single powerful politician. What a powerful politician brings to these huge deals is speed. The Chicago Skyway was sold by Mayor Daley in 61 days, from RFQ to financial close. The Indiana Turnpike lease, promoted by Governor Mitch Daniels, was signed in 114 days. And in both cases, the political task included getting enabling legislation passed in the legislature that actually enabled the procurement to proceed. That's quite an accomplishment. The $1.8 billion Skyway and the $3.8 billion Turnpike deals are the largest deals ever done in those states. So the amount of infrastructure privatization in America depends on the supply of brave politicians. And that's not to diminish the possibilities, which is what I sell, is the possibilities. Mine is the Journal of Plausible Outcomes. There are two types of infrastructure privatization projects: greenfield projects where you're starting from scratch, and brownfield projects where effectively you're buying cash flow. Brownfield projects are very popular. 32 different companies from all over the world submitted their applications to be qualified for the Pennsylvania Turnpike privatization. For greenfield projects are very unpopular. There are 3 procurements going on now in Texas and Florida within the past 2 weeks. Only 2 bidders each showed up for those procurements, and the states had spent millions of dollars preparing the bid documents for those procurements. Neither kind of privatization is very popular. In the 20 years that I've been keeping track, there have been only 14 transportation privatization transactions in the United States worth just under $12 billion that have been completed. And they involved combinations of only 6 different equity investors. 8 of those projects are brownfield deals where the total debt and equity is $8 billion, and 6 are for about $3.5 billion for greenfield projects, again, the more risky projects. All of those are toll roads. There's only one construction company in the United States that's been willing to invest in these deals, and that's Fluor Corporation, and typically they're not in for more than 10%. There have been no airport or public transit privatizations in the United States. There's no greenfield seaports that have been privately financed, though terminals have at seaports. Outside the regulated business in the water area, there have been only 2 water deals in the past 20 years that have involved private equity investors. Transportation privatization is illegal in New York, Pennsylvania, Michigan, Illinois, Ohio, California, and other states where there's strong public employee unions. And yet there is great excitement and great disappointment in this market. Much of the unhappiness in this family comes from political risk. The U.S. is the only country in the world where municipal governments can issue their own debt. Because they have fiduciary responsibility, local governments here think like owners. What that means is that the development risk in these giant projects starts at the bottom of the pile. It's highly dispersed. In the rest of the world, political risk runs from the top down and is more manageable. The billion-dollar Miami tunnel project that was referred to was awarded 18 months ago to an Australian investment group that had teamed up with France's largest contractor, Bouygues. It was canceled by Governor Christ this week after the state had spent $40 million and the private sector maybe twice that. It was Jeb Bush's project, and it had lost momentum under Governor Christ. Much of the delay was due to brinksmanship over local funding between the city of Miami and Dade County. That never would have happened in Spain, France, or Ghana. It scares the daylights out of even the biggest firms. Granted that political risk gets priced in bids, but contracts have to be signed, financing arranged, construction completed, and forecasts come true in order for those risks to be compensated. Quick summary. The financial model needs to be reinvented. The deals done are one-off transactions. A powerful politician is the secret of success. Political risk is paramount in the private sector's consideration of where to invest, and privatization is a minuscule part of the U.S. transportation market, and it isn't going to get any larger because of federal policies. Finally, under the heading of desperate politicians do desperate things, I'll end my talk with two Hail Marys. The first is the New York State Thruway Authority will form two operating subsidiaries, one for the rural north and one for the suburban south. Thruway South, starting at Route 17, will be auctioned to the highest bidder for a long-term lease. Tolls will be doubled to about 10 cents, which is still cheap, 10 cents a mile, and that will net enough to pay for a new Tappan Zee Bridge. The second, the New Jersey Turnpike will be auctioned off to the Abu Dhabi Sovereign Wealth Fund and 3 Canadian public pension funds. That'll be done in order to stave off bankruptcy by the state of New Jersey. Anything is plausible right now. Mine is the Journal of Plausibility. Thank you.
And our final panel speaker for our first panel is John Foote, a senior fellow at Harvard's Kennedy School of Government, where he works specifically in the area of transportation policy, particularly privatization. Before coming to Harvard, he was co-founder and executive vice president of TransCore, which is a firm specializing in intelligent transportation systems, and a public finance investment banker. John.
Thank you and good morning. In Howard's earlier introduction, he set me up as the critic today, which I guess is only appropriate since we've had perhaps a cheerleader, a doomsayer, a cold-eyed banker. So I guess a critic, or I would perhaps more appropriately say a skeptic, is just about right in the lineup. Traditionally, over the last century, most of the elements of our infrastructure have been the province of the public sector. But there are numerous reasons, both market-based and political, why government has proven not to be up to the task of maintaining our infrastructure adequately. Further, and this might come as a surprise for some of you who presuppose what I'm going to say, I think most of us in this room believe that the private sector does have a value-added role to play in partnership with the public sector in getting things right. In fact, I bet few in this room would disagree with our luncheon speaker's recent 3R proposal, where she stated that the involvement of the private sector, and I'm quoting, can reduce costs, accelerate project delivery, better allocate project risk, all resulting in higher quality projects. Again, I can sign up to that. I do draw the line, however, that this involvement, this private sector involvement, requires or is particularly benefited by the injection of private capital. Unfortunately, and with all due respect to John, the rationale for the private sector's role has been shanghaied by the financial community. The debate around public-private partnerships, and particularly concession deals, has been reduced to dollars and cents, with short shrift being given to the public interest. It's short shrift whether or not the private sector is actually, to use Mary Peters' terminology, reducing costs, accelerating project delivery, allocating project risk, let alone delivering a project that is truly in the public interest. The fact is that the problem with infrastructure in this country is not due to a lack of public capital, but it's instead due to a loss of political courage to levy the necessary user fees or raise taxes to support capital. When we steal the courage, the political courage, to raise tolls, as was the case recently with the Pennsylvania Turnpike Commission, the Commission was able to float additional tax-exempt bonds to support road and bridge infrastructure around the Commonwealth. Now, the GAO, in a recent study of P3s, stated that there is, quote, no free money in public-private partnerships. Private capital also needs to be supported by user fees and taxes. So what's the advantage to private capital? As one commentator observed, privatization is a way for the public sector to outsource political will to charge for a service. I don't think we should be letting our elected officials off the hook so easily. If you accept my argument that there is sufficient public capital, you might still ask, why not use private capital if it is available at a comparable cost to public capital? The reason is private capital, in my view, comes with baggage that can work against the public interest, particularly in infrastructure projects. Let me be more specific. First, despite regulatory constraints, a consequence of private capital is upward pressure on user fees due to a natural desire to maximize returns on investment. Public authorities, on the other hand, by their nature, attempt to keep tolls, or other types of user fees, as low as possible while still meeting their obligations. I believe that users of our roads, airports, power grid, and other types of infrastructure should pay the full cost of the service, but they should not have to pay any more. A second reason is that private capital perturbs the structure of public-private partnerships, resulting in overly long deals with terms that always have at their root the protection of the interests of the investor. Otherwise, the deal doesn't get done. Concessions in excess of 50 years, which has been the norm in this country, are driven purely by financial considerations and not by the public interest. Third, the private capital is blind to externalities. The motivation of the Skyway Bridge concessionaire in Chicago is not to alleviate congestion, which actually is a very big problem in the Windy City. The motivation is instead to maximize net revenues on the bridge. Now, that's certainly not evil, far from it. But by the same token, it is not consistent with the collective interests of the residents of the Chicago metropolitan area. I suggest we decouple private capital from other types of private sector involvement. There are many examples of companies with proven expertise and capability entering into contracts with governments to design, build, and operate infrastructure. Under these arrangements, we get all of the benefits called out by Mary Peters, but with none of the possible distortions that are a natural consequence of private capital. If the governor of Pennsylvania's objective was to operate the Pennsylvania Turnpike more effectively and efficiently than was being done by the Pennsylvania Turnpike Commission, rather than the motivation of using the Pennsylvania Turnpike as a fundraising tool, he could have hired Albertus, one of the most professional and well-respected road operators in the world, without having to also include city infrastructure investors, which, to be candid, does not bring much to the party except cash. The private role of capital in public infrastructure should be a supporting one at most, in my view. If we let private capital become the lead actor, it steals the show and possibly the public interest. Thank you.
Okay, I'm sure there are going to be a few questions. Let me just lead off, and there may be a few arguments amongst here. But, you know, we're treating this discussion as if it's a fork in the road and we're choosing between public and private, but yet somehow this huge gap in filling our infrastructure needs has developed, not only in building new infrastructure, but in maintaining our existing infrastructure when elected officials were not under pressure to privatize. I'd love to ask you, Steve, if I might, your sense as somebody who's been involved in the political arena as well, why did that happen? Why has infrastructure gone to the back of the line, as it were?
When I first took office in New York City,
Okay.
I remember running to my window to look at the demonstrations in front of City Hall, and the biggest problem is making sure that the landlords don't demonstrate the same day that the tenants demonstrate. Engineers don't demonstrate, okay? All sorts of social programs do lead to demonstrations by people and very large, highly visible political pressure. It's very easy to defer maintenance, it's very easy to defer construction of a new project and so on. It's much harder to defer what are perceived to be immediate human needs. And I think that is the biggest and foremost difference why engineering projects, infrastructure projects, and so on have gotten a short shrift. They just haven't had the priority in face of more visible things. Engineers don't demonstrate. The absence of bridges, it's something missing rather than something present. And I think that kind of psychological reason is the basic reason why very short-sighted things take place, and we don't get the political will. And that's absolutely right. Political will I found all over the world. Political will is the talent and biggest shortages in political will, and it's the one absolutely necessary ingredient. And Bill, I think, pointed out correctly the kind of issues involved. That's what I think is the
So advice to
situation.
investors: find an elected official early in his term who really wants to do this.
Exactly right.
Okay.
Be a young man.
and a young man. You know, I heard if there was any point of agreement, it was hard to find among our panelists, that there was enthusiasm for build, operate, transfer projects as opposed to leasing projects. We're going to explore some of the leasing projects that have been done in our second panel. And yet, Bill Reinhard tells us that for a leasing project, there were 32 bidders, and for a build, operate, transfer greenfield project, there were only 2 bidders. Bill, can you explain that? And I'd love to get John Ma in on that too.
Environmental risk. That's what that's the private sector and the public sector together are enmeshed in the environmental process. It's impossible to estimate. The cost is high. The public sector wants to be a good partner, but gets sort of locked into this process. The private sector is forced to assume all kinds of risks in these kinds of deals. The returns the IRRs are estimates. They're not guaranteed returns. There's lots of other places to put your money and take your risks in America. There's plenty of opportunities other than these high-risk kind of projects where all of the development risk falls on the private side. So some have even included right-of-way acquisition. Rarely, but those kinds of things are shifted from the public sector to the private sector too often and become very difficult to handle.
And so perhaps if Florida had mitigated that risk up front, there might have been more bidders.
More bidders, and again, I think just there's other places to make money. There's too much risk in the BOT business. There's just not that many. Greenfield projects are difficult. Brownfield projects are very attractive and get plenty of bidders. Again, because you don't have construction risk and you don't have a lot of those level risks.
John, a very quick question for John Foote. John, I wonder whether you want to stick to your no need for private capital at a point where we're seeing tremendous impact, certainly here in New York State, on the revenues available both to the city and the state, which has caused the governor here to say we've got to find other streams of capital, whether it's because of limits on debt borrowing, as John Ma referred to, or simple, incredible cyclical downturn versus very high deferred maintenance.
Well, if you go back to Bill Reinhardt's Hail Mary on the Tappan Zee Bridge, you know, what makes that Hail Mary work is increasing tolls significantly on the southern portion of the thruway. Without increasing those tolls, there's no private capital is not going to be interested. And to my knowledge, the New York State Thruway Authority has not bumped up against its debt limit, which I only think it has a debt limit on revenue bonds. And so the question is, if you're going to increase the tolls on the southern end of the thruway, is that best used to support public capital or private capital? And can you get the other benefits of private involvement without having to go through what Tony had talked about, with these incredibly high transaction costs associated with bringing in a private, I'll use the term advisedly, private owner for the deal. The concession agreements that have been used, and we'll be hearing from the author of those concession agreements later, for Chicago and Indiana, I mean, they are big, big documents. And almost all of that document is necessary because of the financial interests of the concessionaire. And in each one, an appendix is actually the operating piece of it. You know, what are the operating requirements? You could probably if you can get away with that big document by taking the financial interests off the table, I think you might be better advised.
And so what we've heard is that tolls may have to go up in any event, and the question is whether efficiencies are going to be brought in by the private sector, so those guys have to turn off the televisions in the toll booths, and maybe that's the rub. If private. Yes. Wait for the microphone.
Dean Angelakos, Jacobs Engineering. I guess I'll just open up to the panel. In applying the model to the New York environment in heavy and highway construction, and Frank here can attest to the environment here, one of the major variables is unionized labor. Given the political clout of unionized labor in heavy and highway construction, how do you account for the flexibility to which Dr. Savas alluded in the ability of the private sector to construct something quickly, financially, expeditious, again, taking into consideration unionized labor with the cost of labor and also the work rules that apply?
And there are no actual public employees working on it now. It's a little bit easier than when you have an existing highway which may be leased out, and the employees then working on it would worry about being laid off or being reduced in number, having the jobs change, and so on. Even so, as an overriding unit, I mean, the labor unions would argue for continued, even that new projects ought to be under union control and so on. But in those cases, particularly if there's an opportunity for, it looks like better economic environment in the state, better construction throughout the state, better business opportunities throughout the state, the unions can be brought along with appropriate concessions or agreements with the new owners and operators, with the new operators, rather.
Anybody else want to weigh in? Bill?
Yeah, you'd have to negotiate a project labor agreement, which often is very expensive. You'd have to change the Wicks law, which gives what otherwise subcontractors turns them into prime contract. You'd also have to enact enabling legislation to allow a design build, sort of a packaging of the design and build under a single contract, because that's the only way you get a fixed price that you can take to Wall Street and say, okay, here's the deal and here's the number. It's not going to change. So there's lots of work to be done before in New York State and New York City that you can sort of get past a lot of the barriers.
Would the Wicks law apply to in a private capital situation?
I assume so. I don't know.
That's state
there's
labor
typically
standards.
money.
We'll hear more about the Wicks law when we talk about the Tappan Zee Bridge, I suspect. A couple more quick. I love hearing from investors and industry people, if anybody else wants to weigh in from those sectors. Anybody? Judge? Hang on.
Thank you. I want to make one sentence observation. Long-term contracts, leases, are often very disadvantageous to the city. Example, the Bronx terminal market, because if these things are good for the city, the contractor walks out and simply abandons them. If they're bad for the city is held to every provision, and the courts see to it that the city pays. And sometimes the contractor's lawyers are better than the city's lawyers. My question is, are there any P3s or projects like that planned for the city of New York or its immediate environs? Anything in the works here? Oh, thank you.
Our own Hope Cohn from the Center of Rethinking Develop is going to be able to answer that, or are you going to ask a question, Hope?
No, I was actually going to respond to that. I think it doesn't come to the level of a toll road or actually any kind of transportation, but we actually have right now what I would call a P3 of this model in the street furniture franchise of the City of New York. The City of New York has a contract with Samusa to install and maintain and operate bus stop shelters, newsstands, and one of these days, automated public toilets. The revenue stream comes from advertising on these structures. And just my own observation of the bus shelters is that they're already technologically so far advanced over anything we'd seen before, and Samusa will have every incentive and ability to update them in a far faster manner than we've witnessed in the past.
I think bus shelters count as transportation infrastructure. A last question? But if not, let's thank our panel.
I think it is clear how fortunate we are to believe in the power of ideas.
Supply the common sense and the fresh thinking of the Manhattan Institute.